Dr. Sally Wilson, PhD. She's a long-term member, along with her family, at St. Paul's and sings in the choir and participates in many of the church's women's spirituality events and activities. Thank you very much. Okay. She studied at Purdue and Cornell universities and is a clinical psychologist practicing in Pepper Pike, specializing in developmental and health psychology. In addition, she studied theology and philosophy and has recently added a spiritual component to her work under the mentorship of Rev Gina, which she will discuss, I think. She's taught at Kenyon, KSU, in their medical school, and John Carroll University, and you may have heard her before because she's presented programs or led for us here on marriage, spirituality, and mental health. And she served as ethics chair and trustee of the Ohio Psychological Association, president of the Cleveland Psychological Association, and president of Ohio Women in Psychology. And now, Dr. Wilson.
Thanks. When I first was asked by Jessie to give this program, I thought, she said, do something on loneliness. And I thought, loneliness, what a downer topic. So I said, how about healing loneliness? So we're going to try to move beyond the grim stuff to what you can do individually, what the church may be doing, what some other churches are doing. And then she asked me also to include something about spiritual direction, which is a new addition to the things that I do, and how perhaps improving one's relationship, and by that I don't mean anybody's relationship with God is poor, but improving your awareness of your good relationship with God and how that might be a mitigating factor in suffering from loneliness. So all of you have had some loneliness at one time, and I'm sure if I ask, every hand would go up. At least short-term loneliness, unless you happen to come from a family of 12. And I never asked this question of the Biermans who used to live next door to us. So they had people coming in and out all the time. And they may have needed solitude occasionally. Okay, so we get this going right? Okay, and there we have Vivek Murthy, who was the 19th Surgeon General of the United States. I'm going to move this out. Maybe I don't need my hand notes here. And he wrote something actually in the Harvard Business Review. And you can find that, I believe, online. And even though loneliness is not a diagnosable disorder, he was very concerned about it. Of course, he himself came from Indian culture. And from my observation, and I'm sure others too, they have on the whole a tighter family sense. And I know I have a godchild who's Indian. And I notice his family is very cohesive. So 40% of Americans report being lonely in a way that is bothersome. He's talking about what physicians are hearing. And chronic loneliness, he says, it's as dangerous to health as 15 cigarettes a day. It's riskier than heart disease, obesity, and type 2 diabetes. And I'll get into some reasons why later. But in his article, he said workplace and sleep problems are implicated. And interestingly, either too little or too much time with family. How about that? And reported absence of friends. That doesn't mean, we'll talk a little bit about perceptual factors too, or I will, and feel free to interrupt me. I'm used to giving 3-hour lectures when I have taught medical students and whatever, and so I'm prepared for forever, you know? So loneliness is not necessarily aloneness. It is a form of suffering related to the perception of aloneness, also real loneliness. And it is different from solitude. Solitude is happy aloneness, the aloneness that you need, the aloneness you need to meditate and pray and to restore yourself, and even extroverts need this time. Loneliness was thought to be found mostly in the elderly, and I think we hear mostly about this. But It's seen increasingly in other groups. And Susan Gray, are you here? She's a kindergarten teacher. And I mentioned to her, she's a choir member, so some people got to hear a little bit about this earlier. And I said, I'm going to include kids too. And she said, good. And we didn't have a chance to talk too much, but clearly her perception was that even at the kindergarten level, kids experience loneliness. I think more from some factors than others, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Men suffer more than women from loneliness, but they don't talk about it. According to the research, part of this has to do with men's lesser tendency to admit vulnerability. We know that men are less likely to go to physicians for medical problems when they have them because, oh, well, it'll be okay. And women, on the other hand, say, oh, there's something wrong. Maybe I should see somebody about it. Okay. Who is particularly at risk? Well, I'm just going to sail down this list. The alone, the grieving, the uprooted and transplanted. I was said to my son Joseph, thanks for coming, that if he ever moved somewhere, one of the things to do is to hook up with a church. It's a family outside of family. And it can be one source of socialization, among other things, among the spiritual and so forth. Feeling estranged or abandoned or rejected is another thing. And I think among the younger folk, the children, feeling rejected is quite often a source of loneliness. Feeling stuck in incompatible families, marriages, or other situations, social. And sometimes not having the popular skill set. And Eileen was talking with me earlier today and was talking about the hustle as the contemporary good news of the workplace, the hustle being not the dance, but at any rate, the hustle being the fast sales and so forth. And that has been found to be a source of alienation and loneliness, certainly competition. Okay, so if you don't have the popular set of skills, even in a college or a neighborhood or whatever, you may feel loneliness. Those without a reference group. What are reference groups? Well, there are the biggies. If you happen to be a Catholic Italian American, you've got a really sound thing. The Episcopalians are a little looser about our identities, you know? Sometimes we'll say we're Episcopalian, sometimes Protestant and whatever, but it doesn't walk through on what Murray would call, who's a psychologist, would call a primary identity. But it could be. I see what's going on at this church, and I see lots of promise. Perhaps things will change. Okay, let's see. And survivors of catastrophes are often lonely. And survivors, if you had a twin who got sick and died at some point, you may feel a really piercing sense of loneliness. And sibling survivors also experience this. Additionally at risk are those depressed or anxious. However, the brain is an interesting thing. And we don't know how many people are depressed and anxious because they are lonely. Because your behavior and your perceptions will actually change your brain anatomy and physiology. You can find it on PET scans and so on. Handicapped people are often lonely because they have a hard time getting around. And chronically physically ill, I want to talk a little bit about an Aspen lecture that I listened to some time ago. And among the presenters was a physician, a primary care physician, who would go out to people's homes, especially the elderly. And they decided, and there are nursing home studies also on providing people with iPads and teaching them how to use them as a mitigating factor of loneliness. If you want to hear what the research says on that, I'll tell you later. But at any rate, she was going to be able, with her group, to give people this kind of electronics, and so she would not have to go out and see them once every, whether it was a month or whatever, depending upon their chronic illness. And patients who were presented this as an option, we're going to give you this device, and we're going to set it up so you can get it, and so forth. And I don't have to come out, you don't have to get ready to see me. A number of them said, do you mean instead of your coming here, I have to use this? those people were lonely, and a visit from the physician was a mitigating factor too, was a gift to them. And she was shocked. She figured maybe it was inconvenient for them to have to get ready to have someone come. And just about anybody situationally. Now just a break in things. I wanted there to be some happiness in there, and I wanted to show you a happy group. And we are pack animals. We are more like elephants and others, dogs and whales, than we are like sharks or tigers or scorpions. And that is our essential health, the immune system, proper functioning of the electrical system. If you want to hear if there are medical types in here and you probably know already if you're a medical type, what kinds of cells are affected by loneliness. I can tell you later. But have you ever seen an isolated elephant? I remember long ago, they used to keep one elephant in small zoos. And elephants begin to show what I would call psychotic behaviors if they're alone. It's hard to talk and demonstrate. They will swing their heads like this, and they will watch their trunks. And they will do other really strange things. Chimpanzees who are isolated, and this is gross, so, you know, they will regurgitate, play with their food, eat it again, do things that are highly unusual if they're isolated. And indeed, you remember the old cowboy movies where the trapper would come into town? Trappers live isolated lives out there. And maybe there were predisposing things. Perhaps they tended to be introverts to begin with. But boy, when they came in from trapping, did they look strange. Do you remember that? Watch a few Westerns. Okay, I don't think you need to see this one. I just talked about it. So cultural trends. The research indicates a dramatic shrinkage in personal and friendship networks in the past 35 years. Our work hours have increased. Remember when we thought that electronics would give us more time? They give us less time, and they are invasive of our social time. And those who identify, by the way, mostly with friends at work tend to be anxious about friendship. Those friendships come and go. People get moved. Our neighbor, for example, had many short-term jobs. She's a wonderful engineer. She finally landed on the Cleveland Clinic staff. But she had jobs for 3 months, 6 months, and so for quite a while when she moved to town. If she had put all of her eggs in that basket for friendships, because she was out of that group, it would have been harder. Perhaps she could retain a friend from each place. But as we shift and as we certainly relocate, those are dangerous things. Divorce rates, of course, are about 50%. That contributes. Other causes. These are all pieces of research. Downsizing in the American family. I told you about our neighbors who had, I don't know how many kids they have, 11, 8, 9? Anyway, I don't think they've ever been lonely. Dispersion. Dispersion of the American family. You know, a lot of times we say basically go west, young man, or go east, young man, or young woman, right? And we don't, you know, we say, well, we'll get together on holidays and whatever. The family, I see more, actually, more realization of the importance of family in the last few years than I had seen for a long time. People planning to stay in the same area with their families. Some people have to move, however, to get their career on the ground. Some move back. So, complexity of work schedules. Do you remember when you were young, did you have breakfast together with your family, perhaps? And supper together with your family, perhaps? A lot did. There was at least one meal a day. And before us, in the agrarian societies, people ate most of their meals together in families. So they had that presence at noontime, too. I think my father walked home from school for lunch. And a number of people. Aaron, did you walk home? Uh-huh, yeah. You did too? How many kids do it now? You've been a teacher, so how many kids did it in your day of teaching? Oh, none. Oh, none, right. Okay. Okay, so complexity of work schedule, mechanization, computerization, loss of jobs, loss of sense of purpose, and we'll get onto that, can often affect one's socialization pattern, aging, partner and peer loss, health factors, mobility, rudeness, exclusion, and bullying are more the things that the young people, I think, tap into. And I'll talk a little bit about a philosophical moment about our Hobbesian style of life, despite our hopefully Lockean style of government in this country. Okay, too much individualism, competition, and materialism. Yes, I mean. All right, this is one of the nicer pictures, by the way. Some of them really don't like him. He wrote Leviathan, and he advocates for a really tough leader of the country. At any rate, he advocated individualism, competition, and he was on the scarcity model. That is, scramble, come and get it. David Brooks, op-ed for the New York Times, he gave a talk recently that he called The Second Mountain, and you can find it online. It was also given at Aspen, by the way. And he talked from a developmental perspective, and his view was that when we are young, we tend to be Hobbesian. That is, we have to find our place in the world. We have a competitive notion, and perhaps that's part of our early adulthood, particularly if we're in the workplace, though I see people not choosing that. And he said, once you get to a certain level, maybe you have time to see what you share with other people, the common things, and you get less focused on your own personal wealth and so forth. Maybe you can loosen up and see the greater good and see the good in others better, as Locke would advocate. All right, kids for a moment, and electronics, I put them together. Look at that picture of kids. One look is worth 10,000 words, I think, right? They are all on some kind of electronic device. None of them is talking to each other, and we see this. Parents complain about kids talking to each other sitting on the sofa. I suppose if you're learning to use your electronics, that might be a moment, but indeed, the use of social media has been implicated in child, adolescent, and young adult loneliness. And by the way, in the experiments where media, like iPads, were given to elders in nursing homes, what they found was that those who were already well socialized enjoyed them, and they were a good thing to give them because then they got to do more outreach. But for those who were not particularly well socialized, they helped not at all. Psychological studies find a decrease in social skills related to the amount of computer use. So we now find parents saying, you get 1 hour a day on the computer other than homework-related stuff, or less than that, and otherwise go find somebody to enjoy a game of whatever with. Okay, virtual relationships, have you heard of them? Virtual relationships are basically a relationship with a computer named Hank or named Doris or something like that. Those aren't popular names, so at any rate, the upshot is you have a relationship with a computer, and some souls have actually said they find them fairly satisfying. Whoa! Cyberbullying I mentioned because I wanted to also talk about young people. Luckily, I saw one particular situation in my office that included that, but was not limited to that. And I was very happy to hear that the police in that area was not in Cleveland Heights per se, but one of the outer suburbs, were right on it. They called an assembly at the school. They announced that that was against the law and that they would appreciate having whoever was responsible confess, because they would find them and they would be prosecuted otherwise. So I think identifying it as not something you can do for a hobby, but something that is actually very damaging is important. So what do the chronically lonely have in common? One is the perception of loneliness, and Murthy and others point out that when it is chronic, there is a sense of threat, continual threat, and it overworks the adrenal glands, and it can be damaging to the body and the brain because of the sense of chronic threat. Secondly, feeling alone even with others, going somewhere and just feeling on the outer fringes, not feeling like one of the group. Increased reports of fatigue, pain, and low mood in physicians' offices and in studies. Weakened immune functioning, and if you're interested, like I say, I can tell you a little bit more about the cells and all that. Eventually, low efforts, and I wonder, low hope of affiliation. What do they need? At least one friend. Now, what's his name? He talks about it. Anyway, there was one person who studied those who are well-functioning. One, Abraham Maslow, pointed out that that's the inner ring. There are inner rings, there's a medium ring and an outer ring for well people. The inner ring are those who are heart to heart. Hopefully all of you have a friend, could be a relative, but hopefully there's more than one, and hopefully it's not just a spouse. Spouses are wonderful in that inner ring. Some of them don't make it, by the way, and that is not so good. So help would be a good idea if that were the case. But having only one is not so good, because you might have needs when that other person is not available or doesn't feel the same needs or whatever. You need 2 to 5 in that inner circle where you're real heart to heart, and you start just where you are. You recognize the differences. One of my friends is in a different more diffuse religious thing, so I say to her, I know what you say on Easter, it's getting lighter and we're feeling better, and she teases me too, but she says sometimes if she lived nearer to this place, she'd be an Episcopal. So, 2 to 5 or better, a pet may help. And a pet can help lonely young people as well as older people. It's not the only answer, but Joan Chittister, who is a Benedictine, has another book. She has now 40-some, I think. And the latest one is called 2 Dogs and a Parrot. And she talks about her youth as an only child and how she could not have a dog initially, but how the parrot helped her to feel less lonely at times. Okay, one or more reference groups. So the church could be a reference group. This is too big a church to be the reference group, I think, entirely. Altar Guild could be a reference group. Nancy, Episcopal Women could be a reference group. There's men's spirituality, there's men's council, there are all sorts of groups. Chaos. Joe enjoyed youth group, right? Right, okay. That was some time ago, but you know, whatever. Okay, one or more gathering places you can go. When I used to work with COSI, and there were men who were beginning, and women, but back in those days, only men, this was some years ago, who were staying home and working from their home. One of the things they noted was they needed some help with depression and with loneliness. And now we see men out in other places. Libraries are wonderful places for people to go if they don't feel comfortable spending a lot of time, as is normal and appropriate. Aloneness is not good for you that much of the time. So change in a sense of worthiness. Sometimes the chronically lonely somehow don't feel worthy of friendship. We're all loved by God, and we can all find our friendship group. I really believe that. Of course, I really think psychologists have to have that attitude too. And also spiritual people, don't you think? Yeah. Okay. And also acceptance of where you are and adventure seeking and finding a good group or two for you. And I send people to Sierra clubs and working in the parks and other kinds of. COSI has at least had a mentoring program for retired professionals to help upcoming professionals. And not trying too hard is part of what's said too. If you try hard, you have a sense of anxiety in it, and other people perceive the anxiety. So you got to relax about the search a little bit and realize you're starting where you're starting from, and that's an okay place to start, and so forth. So, what can you do to help individually? Listen. Listening is such an art form and such a lost one. Don't we all interrupt each other too much? Listening deeply, without judging, by the way, and also without fixing. Often this is an issue in marriages too, by the way. People want to fix each other, and the other one just wants to be listened to. Transport. Some people need a ride. I noticed in women's spirituality, that's an asset. There are women who pick up other women, and I'm glad for it. Refer and accompany another to a group. If you just refer somebody and say, oh, why don't you go to the knitting group at the church or whatever, the answer may be, okay, I'll think that over. If you say, why don't you go to the knitting group at the church, I can pick you up at 1:45 such and such, and we'll go together, people are more likely to go. Okay? Refer to a helping professional if you see need. If somebody looks grimly depressed or is really very anxious or fears going out of their home, they need help. Avoid blaming the victim. I want to mention to you that some simple meds, for example, some antibiotics cause low mood, which may contribute to withdrawal tendencies in people. So if something that simple can contribute, people are not at fault for being wherever they are. And if there's anything I'd like to leave you with is a sense of acceptance of yourself if you're lonely. If 40% of the population is lonely, that means there are lonely people here today. And acceptance of yourself, and also acceptance of others who seem to be lonely or withdrawn. Another nice picture, right? There were elephants. Picture's worth 10,000 words, right? I Googled in Google Images, multiracial, multi-generational, happy group. And I got an interesting assortment. I thought, oh, this one is the one that brings most life to my eyes. And guess what it is, by the way? I looked at the pictures first. Underneath it said, house church. Isn't that interesting? I thought, well, that's a keeper, and we can always talk about house churches, and I could always turn this over to Jeannie or Jessie, because a lot of people enjoy them. They're a little different from foyer groups since they involve worship. Okay, a theological moment. In Genesis, people were not made to live alone, and I can't remember which of the Genesis writers wrote this, but it is true. Paul Tillich. I used to like to read Paul Tillich when I was a young person, when I was an adolescent and when I was early in college. And he talked about sin as separation. Isn't that interesting? And the need for, we usually read that word atonement. And he broke it apart and he said, at-one-ment. We need to feel together, certainly in church with the body of Christ. And if you want a sample sermon, I think one of his most beautiful sermons is You Are Accepted, and you can find it in full on the internet, because I recommend it sometimes for people who need a boost and who are open to spiritual solutions. Okay, the church addresses loneliness, services, forums, classes, and I mentioned the size of the church determines niche identification needs. There are some things listed there. Many groups have subgroups. Even the vestry is a sort of identity group. The choir certainly is, and I'm missing practice. At any rate, we kind of hang together sometimes. We even do socialize, though I'd like to see more of that, actually. Individual visitation includes pastoral visits, Stephen ministry, Eucharistic visitors. I think there's a little room for growth, and I brought some. I was really happy to hear all the stuff we did last week at the annual meeting. Wow! do we have a lot of places to connect? And a new program is Sages, and I think that's a wonderful one for people who, as I understand, are retired but still active. And I heard a little bit about that. That sounds wonderful. When I was visiting a friend in Athens, Ohio, she talked about being a member of a village. And I brought a brochure on that, an elder village. And a part of the goal is to help people stay comfortably in their own homes. But it's a social group, and they pay some dues, but they share a handy person who is approved in the group. They have references. They also have outings and things. And Connie Hansen, who's in Florida for the winter, she told me is interested in this too. So maybe there's another part doing for older people. So individual visitation, I'm in the Stephen ministry, pastoral visits, Eucharistic visitors. Yeah, okay, covered. Less common practices, we can talk about these, and religious communities, of course, you know, we have nuns and monks. We do, but not many. Right, not many. There's a group of men, I believe, up in the Detroit area. And I don't know how many women are left down in Cincinnati. I think only 2 or 3. So it's not a thriving thing. But, you know, what's her name? Sociologist Margaret Mead talked about women outliving men. And it's not exactly the Golden Girls vision, but that women might need to find some living together community. And maybe some church will be interested in starting that. You know, I've even sometimes had visions of my own house and somebody else's house. I think, now how would this work as a living place? If need be. But I think Aaron, who comes from a family where people live almost to 100, is likely to outlive me. So it's not going to be for me to develop, I think. So religious neighborhoods. Now, I have mixed feelings about this, but there are a fair number of Catholic developments where people buy in the same neighborhood who belong to the same Catholic church. There are a couple in Akron. They often homeschool their kids, and the kids get together for other activities, whatever. And since I work with seminarians too, I've heard pros and cons. Some love it, and some say, I was dying to go to public school. So, what can I say? But, and by the way, it's not as if you can't buy in that neighborhood if you're not a member of that church. It's just a decision to buy in a certain development. So, house church, I won't talk too much about it. We have clergy here who could probably do a better job. Listening ministries, we had one through Stephen Ministries, I believe. And
we have one.
You have one, Arlene. And it's where?
It's here.
Oh, it is here. So there's somebody who sets up a sign that says from 6 to 9 we listen?
It's a one-to-one ministry.
Aha, okay. Is it through Stephen Ministries?
Yes.
Okay, yes. Oh, good. That's good. And of course, from what I saw, I asked for your materials, and the emphasis was on listening, non-judgmental, and not giving a lot of suggestions. It was listening deeply and not fixing, right? Okay. Spiritual direction is something that I'm kind of newly in. I've thought over time, actually, about going into ordained ministry, though I love psychology. And at one point I was talking with Jeannie about it. She said, why don't you go into spiritual direction? And after we talked about it, you more or less said, Jeannie, that you thought I was ready to go. So I asked her to be my mentor, because in spiritual direction programs, you are always supervised or mentored. And so now I'm seeing a few people for spiritual direction. If you have a few questions about that, I'm happy to talk a little more about it. And this is not my well-developed explanation, because, you know, we have to finish up at some point. But the purpose is to grow in relationship with God, an enrichment option, and perhaps an antidote to loneliness. And Jessie, I credit you for bringing that up. And indeed, if you want to look at the psychological research, those who claim to have a strong relationship with God in very late life have more peaceful deaths. So there is research on that. So there's an antidote to loneliness in it. Common topics include, well, I just threw them, I didn't put them in any particular disorder. Discernment is a way of making decisions that involves the whole heart in prayer and your relationship with God, as well as good sense. But the development of greater joy is one of the things too. There's a book out on prayer that says from obligation to enjoyment or something like that. I can't remember, it was a little stronger word at the end. And I must say in my own prayer life, when I was a kid, no, I don't need to sleep, our Father, etc. And as I grew, I began to realize, wow, prayer is really a wonderful thing. And I'm a big consumer of it and love it. And I find when I start my day with it and do some touching base through prayer through the day, that my day is better. And, okay, joy, ways to pray. There are many different ways to pray, and we've talked about some in women's spirituality in the past. I don't know if it'll come up as a topic again. I have a wonderful little copy of something that came out from the Forward movement on understanding praying the hours that I love to give to people I work with because it's so accessible. And then there are other things, even simpler, by a Catholic, a Jesuit named Thibodeau, that sometimes help with this keeping contact with God through the day. Okay, carrying life's burdens is part of it. Forgiveness, meaning and purpose, that's just an assortment of things that are covered. Means usually monthly visits with a theologically and psychologically trained spiritual director who also has spiritual practices that he or she enjoys. If you want a little history on this, the ancient church is an ancient church resource updated in the mid-20th century. The Desert Fathers and mothers used to do this, and in our tradition from Anglicanism, Dame Julian of Norwich used to do it. Wasn't it Dame Julian who had a sort of lean-to against a church? And people used to come to the window to talk to her. She also had a window on the other side into the church so that she could be brought the sacrament daily. So how other things came to her and met her needs and whatever, I don't know. But at any rate, so I've not read a whole lot about her, but I know that she is one in our own tradition. Popular forms in the 20th and 21st century include Ignatian Jesuit, and we have a program at John Carroll on that. It's described to me as quite heady, by the way. Franciscans, I like a little bit of everything, by the way. I like some of the Ignatian stuff, and I mentioned, or I was going to mention Thibodeau, who's a Jesuit and Ignatian, whose material is used at Villa Maria, where the HM nuns teach spiritual direction. And so I've read some of his things and I like those. Ignatius, by the way, was a soldier. And so, as several people said who I considered going into these programs, and a couple of people said, I think if he was more Franciscan. I mean, the first thing, it's a structured program and you start out with your guilt. You just do. And then you go through different stages. It's a 4-week program if you do it full time, and then the 19th annotation allows you to spread it out. Anyway, Franciscans, I think kind of the leading book on that by Richard Rohr is called Eager to Love. And of the two, I think I fit more with a Franciscan in terms of being open to others' agendas. Anglican and Episcopal, in that context too, I like Margaret Gensler's book on spiritual direction. She has a very active practice as an Episcopalian in New York City. She also talks about people who seem to identify her on the train as she comes and goes. Begin talking with her. Of course she wears, I think she's okay. She was out. Anyway. So my preference is eclectic. I like to choose from what seems to help people. And I think I'm done.